Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon and welcome to this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. A joy to have you join us. We are opening this hour by speaking with Marianna Orlandi about the new Italian ban on surrogacy. The questions that you and I need to ask ourselves in light of this, which is it's a good thing to be sure, but Italy has issues and it's been undergoing a population decline for some time now. Surrogacy is not the solution to the problem. Some questions arise. For example, should children gestated and born in violation of Italian laws be taken from these putative parents, or should Italian sovereignty capitulate, accepting that whatever adults want and pay for, even other lives, becomes a right? And this is at the heart of the real question of surrogacy, the commodification of the life of the unborn. Children become objects of privilege. Very rarely are people pursuing the advent of surrogacy in light of truly overcoming infertility as an issue. Very often, and honestly, it's often to the detriment of the question of adoption. Last November, when the Italian Parliament reaffirmed its commitment to protecting the dignity of women and championing the right of each child to his or her own family, the question of prohibiting the commercialization of the human person became a major concern. And the legislative process was actually surprisingly smooth. It went through rather easily, and the chambers approved a bill that made surrogacy a universal crime. Now, this is in recognition of the fact that so much has to be violated in natural law to make surrogacy even possible. And at its core, however, at its crux, alongside the commodification of the child, is also the objectification of the body of the woman and the objectification of the principle of life that the human person possesses. So all of these will become part of our conversation in terms of how Italy has banned surrogacy. We then go on from there to speak about we speak with our friend Os Guinness about the greatest revolution in history. True revolutions bring about true freedom to society and the human soul. Os Guinness examines two kinds of revolutions that we have seen in human history. The first being the French Revolution, that led to some of the greatest detriments that we have seen befalling Europe. But on the other hand, we also go further back in history. Os takes us all the way back to the Magna Carta of humanity itself, the Magna Carta of ancient Israel. And that is the question of the Sinai Covenant, the revolution that sparked a new moral order, first in the Near East, and then from there to the rest of the world. In the civilized West, the Ten Commandments still forms the crux of the epitomization of natural law as enshrined and therefore endowed in natural reason and livable by all human persons. And so we speak about all of this after the headlines.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. This is your Ave Maria Radio News for Tuesday, January 14th. It's the feast of St. Felix and Nola. Today's news is brought to you by Ave Maria University. Your vocation location is at avemaria.edu. Southern California residents are being warned that the next 24 hours will be very dangerous due to high winds. Los Angeles City Fire Chief Kristen Crowley on how the city is preparing.
For this significant wind event, we are taking an aggressive lean-forward posture, and the LAFD has staffed all available resources, strategically placing fire patrols and engines in the unimpacted high fire risk areas in the city.
The wildfires near Los Angeles erupted a week ago and have damaged or destroyed thousands of structures while killing at least 24 people. Former special counsel Jack Smith says Donald Trump would have been convicted in his election interference case had he not been elected. Overnight, the Justice Department sent Congress the final report from Smith, who resigned last week ahead of Trump's inauguration. The report covers his investigation of Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, including the build-up to the January 6th Capitol riot and the riot itself. Pope Francis has appointed Dr. Mary Healy as one of 4 new members of the Vatican's Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. Healy is a regular guest on Ave Maria Radio and a professor at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. The Dicastery, which is comprised of about 24 ordained and lay people from all over the world, directly advises Pope Francis and oversees matters related to the practice and promotion of the Mass, sacraments, and liturgies in the Latin Church. The Texas Supreme Court is deciding the fate of an El Paso Catholic nonprofit. The state attorney general's office wants to shut down Annunciation House, which houses illegal immigrants who have been processed and released by the Border Patrol. Associate Deputy Attorney General Ryan Bosch argued that the charity's religious affiliation should not protect them from prosecution and likened their shelter to a cartel stash house. Lawyers for the charity say they work with the feds all the time and refuse to shield those with a warrant for their arrest. From your Ave Maria Radio.net news desk, I'm Steve Clark.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Last year, the Italian Parliament approved a bill that makes surrogacy a universal crime. Now, the country has historically never allowed surrogacy within its borders, and this new law makes it so that it's a universal crime. Italians will find true difficulty obtaining the service even abroad. We talk about the law and the ethical problems of surrogacy with Marianna Orlandi. Marianna Orlandi received her PhD in law from the University of Padua, Italy, and from the University of Innsbruck, Austria. Prior to moving to Texas, she was a 2019-2020 James Madison Associate Research Scholar and lecturer in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Marianna, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing great. Thank you. Thank you for this invitation.
Well, the pleasure is truly mine, and I'm really glad to be able to talk about this. Italy is one of the few nations in the world, especially in Europe, that is still attempting to hold on to some level of natural law when it comes to its understanding of the family, which seems to be a driving force for this expansion of making surrogacy a universal crime.
Yeah, it's probably true what you say there, maybe when hanging on to natural law. One thing that is coming to mind for me is that Italy, along with Germany, we lost the Second World War, and we were responsible for some of the worst atrocities. So people in those countries, they saw what we're capable of doing when we don't respect the dignity of the person. And so part of what I'm thinking is that the memory is so vivid and so clear and so recent that there's probably more hesitation in commercializing and objectifying anything that is human. That's maybe one way to read it.
Right, and in fact, when you think about Italy's adoption laws, that seems to exemplify exactly what you're talking about, the ancient Roman principle of adoptio naturam imitator, which you highlight, adoption imitates nature. This, having seen how denigrating the dignity of the human person can result in true atrocities, the Italian government now seems to want to hold stalwart to these pillars of natural law when it comes to marriage and the family.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are so many differences. I've been having studied law when I was still in Europe, and I've lived in the U.S. for a while now. I even remember that whenever I talk of something being unconstitutional, I need to specify that, our constitutions are very recent, and they're very long, and they contain all the rights and duties and all the things that we understood after so many mistakes. Like, there is an approach, I said to the person earlier, but as I say to the family, that is just somehow is a lot more sophisticated and less left to the market, quote unquote. It seems to be often the case, in the U.S., where there's a lot more faith and a lot more conviction and a lot more dedication to the right principles, maybe at an individual level, but at a state level, everything is left to these invisible forces, right, of the market, which I think is still unthinkable in the European context. if that answers, I mean, what you're...
It does. It does,
Yeah.
and in fact, it prompts a further question. Given the reality of, especially here in the United States, the almost glorification of free market principles, sometimes to a detriment, you think about the Italian government right now, what kind of criticism is, at the lowest level, the media levying against the government, global media especially?
Yeah, sorry, is that a question?
Yeah. What kind of media pushback is the Italian government seeing as a result of this measure?
I mean, of course there is pushback, but not to the extent that you could expect in California. The left in Italy has been against the objectification of the human person. The left in Italy was the one arguing for the rights of the workers. So the left in Italy is, there's a lot of women journalists on the left that are absolutely against surrogacy because it's a way to exploit women, or even if it's not a way to exploit them because, say, they're going to do it for free, which then, there's being for free, but still is a way in which the woman will lose sight of this value of her own body and of her own maternity. So there is a pushback, of course, but I do think that the pushback comes more from the ginormous entities that benefit from the commercialization of fertility. And in that sense, there's one thing where I don't really know that I can, that I qualify as a conservative in U.S. terms, only because I do think that there are some things that are a lot better when healthcare is public and when there is not a market that is fueled by what, my PhD supervisor would say that law has started to go crazy when we've transformed desires into rights.
Right.
And so if these desires can become something that you pay, they pay for, so then you pay a lot of money to get a child, then there's someone who's going to be interested, and is going to be interested in publishing articles against you and having an opposition and sponsoring a whole party that is going to make, surrogacy a right for all. Then I don't think it's going to ever be free for all, right? So it would be interesting if the same person would be saying, oh, no, it's going to be a right, and it's going to be something that anyone can, at no cost. That I'm pretty sure is not going to happen. But I do think, there is a thread in the interests I've had in so many careers and places I've lived in, and I think I always think of a moment in 2008 where I was an exchange student in Berkeley, and I saw for the first time an ad that was like for buying eggs from women who were white, who were going to an Ivy League, who were between a certain age, and there was a price. And my European legal mindset was absolutely shocked. Just like, seriously, are we seriously selling bodies? Like, selling, but yeah, so this is what we're facing. And I think, no matter where one stands with the Italian government, whether you like it or not, I think that a choice to say, hey, we thought this is illegal, we're just going to repeat it. And if you want, I can tell you what exactly was happening and what this move meant. Because, it's been described as, it's becoming a universal crime, but actually it was just a way for the Italian government to say, let's at least pretend that we have a law that someone is going to respect, because it was so easily violated that it was becoming sort of a joke.
Right. So if I may pivot then, just in light of, like you mentioned, when we make desires into rights, that's when we have a problem, especially in overt exercise of the free market. Where does Italy stand in terms of adoption rights for homosexual couples?
Okay, now, because I'm out of the country, I hope I'm not saying, I'm just going by memory, but the memory is that we have an institution called adoption in particular in exceptional cases. So what happens is the partner can adopt the child of one of the two in a same-sex union. We call them civil unions. So so it's not a married heterosexual couple, only a married heterosexual couple that has been together for a stable number. I hear music in the background. I don't know if I'm
So, we're going to have to cut off right now, but we'll continue this conversation on the other side of the break. My guest, Marianna Orlandi, who received her PhD in law from the University of Padua, and we are talking about Italy's recent universal ban on surrogacy. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
Do you own popular index mutual funds or ETFs? If so, you're automatically owned shares of companies that conflict with your moral beliefs. Ave Maria mutual funds are managed to conform to pro-life and pro-family values. Long-term investors can invest in the no-load Ave Maria mutual funds. The experienced professional portfolio managers make decisions based on investment fundamentals and pro-life values. You can learn more about Ave Maria mutual funds today at 866-AVE-MARIA or visit AveMariaFunds.com. When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
I've seen the difference in my son since he's been at Ave Maria. He's happy, he's excited about what he's going to do with his degree, and he's living his faith.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
We are the pro-life generation, passionate about building the culture of life in our healthcare and in our nation. But not all healthcare options are equally pro-life, and some provide morally objectionable procedures. CMF Curo is different. CMF Curo is a pro-life Catholic healthcare ministry providing a pathway for its members to build the culture of life in their healthcare choices, not destroy it. Learn more about CMF Curo at mycatholichealthcare.com. That's mycatholichealthcare.com.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. My guest, Marianna Orlandi, who has her PhD in law from the University of Padua, Italy, and we are talking about Italy's new ban, universal ban on surrogacy. So, Marianna, we were talking earlier about where the Italian government stands in terms of same-sex couples in civil unions, especially in terms of adoption. Now, a lot of those laws are written in light of, as I mentioned earlier, that ancient Roman principle that you've rightly alluded to, adoptio naturam imitator, and so there's an effort here for the most part at the level of the Italian government to recognize that there's something still dignified about human persons, about the natural structure of marriage, and even the gametes. That's the way the law is written of the human person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, I'm not always proud of being an Italian, but there are certain things that I'm proud of, and definitely the way we handle this kind of matter is something that I'm proud of. And the reason, I mean, if we study, an Italian and study law, I study Roman law, and we study marriage and we study adoption as institutes that follow nature. These are not, these are not human constructions, social constructs. These entities, these realities come before us. So we do have adoptions to help children who are without parents. That's why we have it. We don't have adoptions because we have adults who want a child. And I think, one just needs to remember that. So with children left without parents meaning a mother and a father. So that's why adoption exists. Adoption of minors. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense that Italy not only wants a married couple of a man and a woman, but also wants this couple to be stable. Because, I mean, anyone who comes from a broken home with tumultuous, and has had two mothers and three fathers knows that it's not a nice environment, and that the reference in age should be, one that is similar to the one that would naturally have. And these are not the rights of adults to adopt. These are the rights of children to have something that resembles a family. Now, there are for same-sex partnerships, we call them civil unions, there has been the recognition of a right to adopt the son or, the daughter of one of the two by the other. It's called the stepchild adoption. So it's called an adoption in particular cases. which we could extend. One could say, there can be cases in life where it makes sense that in this partnership of two people there is an adoption. Okay, fine. But this is something different from saying, this is not right that we cannot have our child. This is something that any single person who's not married and doesn't have a kid, might start saying. It's like, it's not right that I don't have a child right now. Mm-hmm. Thus forgetting that a child is not a product of our imagination, but is another. There was a talk many years ago. Whenever I meet Professor Carter-Snead that teaches at Notre Dame, and I know everyone knows him, but he gave a talk several years ago that I always remember. That was about adoptive parenthood, and he, in his remarks, he said, if only all biological parents remembered that children are always gifts. So, even when they're truly yours and you're the biological mother or father, this other is a gift that was just entrusted to you. So, and in that logic, it's just the opposite of something that you can desire and buy. And maybe, buy in another country and then bring back home and expect your home authorities to recognize it as your own.
Right, and that's the nature of this universal ban that, like you mentioned, at the local level even, it was becoming a bit of an issue. And so Italy wants to reinforce the fact that there's a certain gift involved in the life of a child. No one has a commodity right. The child is not a commodity over which we can impose our rights over, and the recognition of this is what's going to bring about a kind of restoration, or at least a recognition of the natural structure of marriage and the family.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because time is a flat circle or something like that. But it was 2015 when I was commenting on a European judgment that was thankfully was reversed. But in 2015, one of the European court said that Italy had wronged these parents that had commissioned basically the child in Russia, so had a surrogacy, then brought it home and demanded recognition. And the courts in Italy did not recognize that child as their own because they were not biologically related. So it could have been basically an abduction of a foreign child. You don't know how this child is ending up in your own country. And so this European court had sentenced Italy to give back 30,000 euro to the family for having violated their private life. And so I brought as a PhD candidate, I was writing on that judgment and saying what is the sovereignty of our state if people can commit something that we consider a crime somewhere else and then come back, and then we have to give them back money just for saying, well, listen, we're not going to do anything against you, we're just not going to recognize this as valid. So thankfully then there was a judgment in 2015 by the European Court, and then the Great Chamber reversed it in 2017. But these things kept happening. So people kept going elsewhere, bringing back the child, recognized by some other, by Canada, by other authorities as the child of the couple, and then they wanted the Italian government to just recognize it, as if that was the case. But so violating so there was an inconsistency then in the system, because how can we, criminal law is the expression of the values of a nation. So you can't just, violating it is not just a matter of regulations being violated. You're violating the culture of the people of the nation. So and that's why I always smile when people call it now a universal crime, because calling it a universal crime sounds like a big deal, but in reality it's just well, it's a crime. Let's just keep it, that it's still a crime. It's not that you can just go across the border, come back, and nothing ever happened.
Go ahead, please.
No, that's So that's all I had to say.
In as much as you're completely right, the expression of the criminal law of a nation tends to encapsulate the kind of civil values that the nation upholds and holds dear. The things that we criminalize show the things that we will not tolerate as a nation. You consider, for example, some of Pope Francis's very strongly worded oppositions against surrogacy in his address to the members of the diplomatic corps. I wonder how much that played a part in Italy moving forward in reiterating its stance on surrogacy.
I think it did in part, although, the people that are in favor of surrogacy are the same ones that are in favor of the euthanasia. Mm-hmm. So they're not, they're very much against any kind of intermission of the voice of the church. And
right.
What I was mentioning earlier is that the left, the European left, is a left that I think still has some sanity and some real care for the poor and the workers and the ones that can be exploited. So I think that in that sense, what keeps being a powerful force against surrogacy throughout Europe, because, the European Parliament has condemned the practice in the past. So there is still this sense where we're too afraid of that being a way of exploitation. Mm-hmm. I'm sure, of course, the Pope speaking against it is still incredibly, helpful. But the people, the voices for the commodification of the person are already very far from the church. And, religion, I often, maybe I exaggerate, but I'm very happy, about the status of, I go to church in Texas, and the churches are full. That's not the case in Europe. That's not the case definitely in Italy. So somehow it's maybe even less powerful there than it is here.
Right. Well, Marianna, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us about this.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was delightful.
Likewise. My guest, Marianna Orlandi, who received her PhD in law from the University of Padua, Italy, and from the University of Innsbruck, Austria. And we have been talking about Italy's new reiteration of its universal ban of surrogacy. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
Underwritten in part by the following nonprofit.
Are you paying high prices with a traditional health insurance company that pays for things that violate your conscience? There's an alternative available. Solidarity HealthShare is a community of faithful individuals and families that never share into immoral medical services, all while saving you money with prices starting as low as $85 per month for singles and $512 for families. Never fund another abortion with your healthcare dollars. Call 844-313-4999 to learn more.
Looking for quality made-from-scratch meals without the stress? At Colasanti's Market in Highland, choose from 12 homemade soups made fresh daily, including our popular broccoli cheddar and lobster bisque. Catering options include lasagna, beef or chicken masticholi, garlic mashed potatoes, and more. Visit colasantis.com. That's COLASANTIS.com or call 248-887-3205.
This program brought to you in part by the town of Ave Maria, Florida.
Ave Maria, a big kind of small town. A golf cart-friendly, ride-your-bike-everywhere kind of town with something for everyone. Resort-style amenities, 2 golf courses, shopping, and dining in our town center. With Ave Maria University and Ave Maria Catholic Church at the core of the community and a wide range of homes to meet your family's needs. Visitors are welcome. More information can be found at avemaria.com. Ave Maria, a big kind of small town.
Light of the East, weekends on Ave Maria Radio.
I am Father Thomas Loya. This week on Ave Maria, as though being born and laid in a manger in Bethlehem was not humbling enough, our Lord chose to lower himself in the lowest spot on the earth's surface, the River Jordan. There he would be baptized for our sake, and God as Trinity would be revealed.
Now on Ave Maria Radio's newest FM stations, 105.5 FM in Southfield and 107.9 FM in Ann Arbor.
Catholic Connection with Teresa Tamio, weekdays on Ave Maria Radio. Jesus Christ, as I say in my book, Extreme Makeover, Women Transformed by Christ, Not Conformed to the Culture, is the biggest woman's libber that ever walked the earth. He was well ahead of his time in the way he related to women, the way he spoke to women, the way he included women in his ministry. If you don't believe me, go to the Gospel of John and read the encounter of the Samaritan woman. Jews did not mix with Samaritans. And yet there Jesus was sitting in a well. The Samaritan woman comes along. And she is coming at the middle of the day because she is living a very, very questionable life. She's coming to the well to avoid the looks and the stares and the comments and the gossip. She comes at midday when pretty much no one be around except there is God waiting for her at the well. Catholic Connection with Teresa Tamia, weekday mornings from 8 to 10 on Ave Maria Radio and AveMariaRadio.net.
Ave Maria School of Law is the Roman Catholic law school in the United States. Consistently ranked in the Princeton Review as one of the best and most conservative law schools, as well as pre-law's most devout law school. Ave Maria School of Law provides a traditional legal education while emphasizing how the law intersects with the Catholic intellectual tradition and natural law philosophy. Ave Maria School of Law, unabashedly Catholic, consistently excellent. For more information, visit avemarialaw.edu.
St. Therese once told her sister Celine that when we trust ourselves and not God, our soul becomes barren and incapable of virtue. Her remedy? External works of charity. We all try to do it on our own sometimes without asking for God's help. At St. Paul Evangelization, we suggest sharing the gospel with someone who needs it. Check out streetevangelization.com to find a team near you where you can share the love of Jesus. If there isn't one in your area yet, perhaps God is calling you to start a team in your city. To learn more, visit streetevangelization.com.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. What kind of revolution brings true freedom to both society and the human soul? Os Guinness joins us to examine the two kinds of revolutions in history, the secular-led revolutions such as the French Revolution and the faith-led revolutions of, in this case, ancient Near East in Israel. And what does it mean for us today? He joins us. Oz is an author and social critic, great-great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, Dublin brewer. He was born in China in World War II, where his parents were medical missionaries. He is a prolific author and speaker on all issues, cultural, political, and the faith. Oz, thank you for joining us. How are you?
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
Oz, you and I are kindred spirits on a lot of levels, especially given our shared heritage. And reading your book, The Magna Carta of Humanity, made me realize that there's a necessity here for us to reclaim definitions when we talk about freedom and the flourishing of the human person in the public sphere. So let's talk about what sets apart the French Revolution from, in this case, the Sinai Revolution, or at least the American Revolution first.
Well, a huge number of differences. One would be different sources. The French Revolution comes from the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, and the American Revolution largely from the scriptures, whether through the medieval Catholic traditions of common law tradition of freedom, or from the rediscovery of what they called the Hebrew Republic, in other words, going all the way back to Exodus and Deuteronomy and so on. So specifically Christian. And then the French Revolution is utopian, whereas the American Revolution is very realistic. Why do you have checks and balances, separation of powers, and so on? Well, you need to because people have fallen. And that, of course, goes back to the Bible, too, and the notion of the three crowns of authority in the Hebrew Scriptures, and so on. So you go on down the line. There are all sorts of differences, and they make a huge difference.
Right.
Obviously, the current one everyone's talking about is justice. They both talk of justice, but the radical left, its ideas of looking for the majority, minority, the oppressor, the victim. You set up a conflict of powers, and you have non-stop conflicts, and the only resolution is what they call the peace of despotism. In other words, a power so powerful it can put down every other power.
Right.
Authoritarianism. Whereas the biblical way, you're really remedying what's wrong through notions like forgiveness, and so you start all over again. They are incredibly different.
Right. And at its core here, there's a recognition of an authority that's, for at least the American Revolution, an authority that's greater than ourselves, that has granted us divinely given rights that we have an obligation to fight for and uphold. In other words, it was a kind of corrective issued against present governing orders. The French Revolution, however, can honestly be marked by a kind of patricidal view of wanting to overturn the world, to turn the world upside down, so to speak, and markedly different in terms of their motivations.
Oh, you're exactly right. But if you think, all the ancient authorities were almost all authoritarian. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, and so on, the Chinese Republic, the Roman Republic, they were authoritarian. And so notions like ordered freedom, which comes from the Gospel and the Exodus, are radically different. Now, we're going into a world increasingly of authoritarianism again. You think of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and so on, and the crisis of liberalism here in the West. We're going back towards that. So it's only the scriptures and the American Revolution should be standing against these firmly, but sadly, there's an awful lot of people wobbling.
Right. And in order to be able to stand firmly, we also need to look at the ground upon which we stand and to recognize what makes it up. And as you rightly note, the American Revolution stood upon the founding ideals of Sinai and the Ten Commandments, and those natural law principles that were revealed by the divine mind that drove the ideals of the founding fathers to pursue a land of liberty, to pursue a notion of liberty that brought about human flourishing in light of accountability to nature's God.
No, exactly. In other words, one of the key things there, if you're under God, well, the Jewish covenant, of course, was a covenant with the Lord, whereas the American Revolution was under the Lord, as Abraham Lincoln put it. But either way, you have accountability higher than the human, which is so important today, because in secular countries, there's nothing higher, and that's part of the problem of growing authoritarianism. So the Jewish understanding is a sustained critique of the abuse of power. So as I said, you have actually three powers. You have the king, the priests, and, importantly, the prophets. And the prophets were social critics, and they had the right and the responsibility to challenge the king. And unlike all the kingships of the ancient world, the Jewish kings were not divine. They weren't God become man on earth. They were human beings, and so on. You see all these limits to power, and that's a key thing today as we go into an increasingly power-dominated world.
Right, and in fact, so much so when you consider, for example, the writings, the quotes, and even the thinking of the French Enlightenment thinkers that spearheaded the ideals of the French Revolution, you really see that the desire here isn't for accountability to a God who has created the world and is therefore greater than mankind. It is about the kind of pseudo-deification of man himself over even the natural and created order.
No, you put it well, and that's incredibly dangerous. So you have the idea in Plato and most of the ancient things that, the rulers are there to rule and the ruled are there to be ruled. Some are gold, some are silver, some are bronze, but not in the Bible. The Lord makes the covenant with all the people, right down to the water hewers and so on. In other words, as Michael Walzer said, it is an almost democracy. And it really is quite extraordinary. And you can see, say, the prophets standing up for the poor and the vulnerable and the weak, because they're made in the image of God. And that notion of humans made in the image of God, that's the absolute bedrock truth we need in today's politics. And if that goes, we're profoundly in trouble.
Yeah. And that's why when you think about the promises of the French Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the ideals that it promised, in fact, it sought to guarantee complete freedom for all, power for the people. But inevitably, all it wound up producing was continental chaos and ultimately temptations that culminated in real acts of dictatorship. It was a failed enterprise from the get-go.
No, it was the birth of modern totalitarianism, and quickly followed by the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. I was there as a boy, and that's the problem. You create a state that has no accountability higher than itself, and that's the problem. Now, a long time ago, your wonderful Catholic historian, Christopher Dawson, way back, 100 odd years ago, he pointed out that countries that have a military or an autocratic background, like Russia or Germany, they would produce a harsh totalitarianism. He said that before Nazism rose. But he warned countries like Britain or the US, which have a more democratic and liberal background, would be inclined to produce what he called a soft totalitarianism. In other words, you'd have an encroaching bureaucratic state with more and more regulations and so on. And of course, that is the way that much of America has gone since FDR and so on. And that's what we've got to stand against.
Right. Well, we are continuing this conversation with Os Guinness, author and social critic, about the notion of freedom that is disparate when we think about the American Revolution versus the French Revolution. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
Support for this Ave Maria radio program comes in part by the non-for-profit St. Anthony Services. Are you shopping for mortgage products, Catholic investing, Catholic health, real estate, or estate planning? StAnthonyServices.org can help you find a Catholic professional for these needs. They regularly connect faithful citizens with faith-based professionals that share our Christian values. More information at StAnthonyServices.org or 877-LIFE-US1.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
This program brought to you in part by the town of Ave Maria, Florida.
Ave Maria, a big kind of small town. A golf cart friendly, ride your bike everywhere kind of town with something for everyone. Resort style amenities, 2 golf courses, shopping, and dining in our town center. With Ave Maria University and Ave Maria Catholic Church at the core of the community and a wide range of homes to meet your family's needs. Visitors are welcome. More information can be found at AveMaria.com. Ave Maria, a big kind of small town.
Italy aficionado Teresa Tamio's newest book is coming soon to the Ave Maria online store. In Italy's Shrines and Wonders, Teresa Tamio provides how best to navigate the most popular sites, best routes, and how to best soak in all the beauty Italy has to offer. She also shares the most inspiring journeys to make your Italy excursion utterly unforgettable. Shrines and Wonders from Catholic Connections, Teresa Tamio will be found soon at AveMariaRadio.net.
I just feel like a woman should have control over her own body, said the pro-choice relative. Control? The only way in which a woman could have control over her body would be by, first, sterilizing her own body, and secondly, and most tragically, by putting herself in a perfect bubble of isolation, away from all relationships, away from all family. And ultimately, this is exactly what contraception and abortion seek, to protect the woman from the danger of otherness. The woman's body, however, is not made for control. It is made for gift. The cycles which wait for seed, the breasts which give nutrition, the womb which harbors new life. God himself abandoned all control at the dawn of creation, to allow the existence of that which is completely outside of himself. He created. He did not merely emanate. From this we know that love does not seek control. It seeks, indeed, the very opposite of control. It seeks gift. GuadalupeWorkers.org.
Ave Maria School of Law is the Roman Catholic law school in the United States. Consistently ranked in the Princeton Review as one of the best and most conservative law schools, as well as pre-law's most devout law school. Ave Maria School of Law provides a traditional legal education while emphasizing how the law intersects with the Catholic intellectual tradition and natural law philosophy. Ave Maria School of Law, unabashedly Catholic, consistently excellent. For more information, visit avemarialaw.edu. When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
My daughter told me she was published in a scientific journal as an undergrad. I'm so proud of her. The world needs Catholic physicists, and my daughter's going to be one of them.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. My guest, Os Guinness, author and social critic. And we are talking about the fundamental differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution and their respective definitions of liberty and ideals of the human person. So, Os, let's define that. For the sake of our listeners, so that we understand, we've talked about driving impetuses. We talked about some of the foundational principles. Let's talk about how the American Revolution viewed liberty versus how the French Revolution viewed liberty.
Well, there are various definitions. I mean, Stanton Evans says the simplest is absence of coercion. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good negative one, but I would prefer to go further. I think freedom is the capacity to choose or to consent. And so that notion of the freedom to choose is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. But the key distinction, and your great Catholic historian put it well, freedom is not the permission to do what we like. That's license. It's the power to do what we ought. Now, what we ought, obviously, what the Lord tells us is the best way of living. But even say, if you're talking to atheists, how do people so live that the way they live will mean that their freedom will last and it can be shared with others too? And there are many views of freedom that are so selfish and individualist that they either wouldn't last or you certainly wouldn't want to share it with anyone. So we've got to define what we're talking about. I think it's the Christian view is a very profound one.
Mm-hmm. And that's why, in light of that, to think about the thrust of the French Revolution and its overt desire to overthrow all the things that were true, good, and beautiful about its heritage was ultimately self-destructive.
Oh, absolutely. And it was the American Revolution was actually a conservative revolution. Mm-hmm. John Adams is very clear. We're trying to keep and preserve our traditional, in his case, English freedoms, Magna Carta and so on. Whereas the French Revolution, the volcanic revulsion against the injustice and the weight of all that had gone on before, just root and branch, throw it all out. Well, that means they're relying on abstract theoretical ideas, which in this case were utopian, and they were disastrous.
Yep.
So it led quickly from a desire for freedom to real authoritarianism and the reign of terror.
It's hilarious that you mentioned that, and so I'm reminded of some of the thought of Foucault and Diderot and Rousseau, and I think about these men and the fact that they put out these philosophies, and they were so utopian. They promised this almost ethereal liberation of the human person. And if you read it without any context, you think, wow, this sounds wonderful, until you realize that in practicum, these men, like Rousseau, for example, lived a horrendous life. And the application of their principles resulted in a complete hypocritical administration that devolved into bloodthirst.
No, again, you're absolutely right. And, I grew up in China, where Mao Zedong used to say he was like a poet, and he had a clean canvas to write paint on or whatever. But always when there's a gap, but when people are utopian, there's a gap between the ideal that they believe in, which is incredible, and the real. No, the way humans really behave. Now, that gap has to be fulfilled somehow, so they do it through coercion, force, and inevitably utopianism leads to violence. Whereas the American Revolution, very realistic. Separation of powers, checks and balances, what Madison calls ambition to counteract ambition. And this way we stop the strongman, the dictator, coming in. And we've got to remember that freedom requires a limit to power.
Yep.
Now, of course, power can change. So for the Puritans who came in here, the power they resisted was the king. by the time of the American Revolution, the power has shifted. It wasn't the king. I mean, George III was behind it. The power was Parliament. And so you think, we mustn't get just stuck with the power is only this or that. No, it can change in any generation. And clearly in our generation, the power in government is this encroachment of federal bureaucracy, the so-called swamp, and so on. And that's what needs to be challenged today.
Right. And a reclaiming of those very same ideals of our founding fathers, the notion of checks and balances of power, the notion of a government by the people for the people, with the express intent of the common good of the populace and accountability to God. Those are the things that need to be reclaimed in the public sphere if we are to reclaim those things that makes America great.
No, I love what you're saying there, and you're quoting Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. Government.
There's nothing original that I say.
No, but did you know, you probably do, that Lincoln himself was quoting. He was actually quoting a pastor from several months earlier, but the pastor was quoting John Wycliffe. And the idea, back in the 14th century, John Wycliffe is saying, if ordinary people can have the Bible and its ways of thinking and living, then you can truly have government of the people by the people. In other words, self-government. So today, one of the biggest challenges is self-government. You've got to have enough virtue and enough faith for people to be able to live responsibly and freely, independently. And that's nothing to be said for granted these days. So the big challenge is actually self-government, and we who are followers of Jesus got to be clear how we can advocate that with really solid grounds, whereas many people can't.
I find myself thinking more and more about John Adams's quote about we have devised a constitution that is for a religious moral people. It is wholly unsuited to any other kind. And as we deviate from that to become an abjectly anywhere from materialist to atheistic, secular structure, how we are unable to reclaim the true spirit of the Founding Fathers, because the spirit of the Founding Fathers necessitates accountability to an authority that's higher than even the highest laws of the land.
No, I call it the golden triangle of freedom. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith, and faith requires freedom, religious freedom, freedom of conscience. And rather like the recycling triangle, it goes round and round and round ad infinitum. Freedom requires virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom, which requires virtue, and so on. In other words, people read something like John, and they say, oh, well, that was a more religious age. Or, this is wonderful, eloquent rhetoric. But actually, the framers were being incredibly realistic. Unless you have virtue, and by that they meant honesty, loyalty, patriotism, and real virtues. Unless you have that, you can't have freedom. And we're beginning to reap the realism today of a generation which has thrown that over, and freedom is going.
And that's precisely why, when you think about the Magna Carta that the founders of the American Revolution appealed to, i.e. the Sinai Covenant, you see that the laws of Sinai themselves present not just a framework to live by, but the checks and balances necessary to renew that legal life, that societal life. And so the structure is contingent upon accountability to an authority that's greater than ourselves. But living in accordance with that authority means that we develop a structure that's virtuous, faithful, and therefore creates human flourishing.
Both the Sinai Covenant and the American Constitution are a kind of form of promise-making. A pledge, a commitment. And the trouble, every political system has its problems, and so monarchy degenerates into tyranny, democracy into mob rule, and so on. And quite clearly in the scriptures you can see that covenantal politics requires promise-keeping, and the Lord keeps his word, his promise. We humans don't do such a good job, as the divorce courts show. And so you can see the need for renewal and a time of rededication. And I'm saying, I'm not American, as you know. I'm saying to many people down here in Washington, 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, many Americans have forgotten what it's about, what it's founded on. You need to have a national day of rededication, rather like Ezra and Nehemiah or Hezekiah, and so on. America needs to remember what it is, where she came from, and what must not be forgotten, or it will be lost.
So I'd like to ask you to expand on why you think it is that these post-French Enlightenment neo-Marxist ideologies have permeated our culture so easily in the modern sphere.
Well, they're much more, classical Marxism, relatively crude, and it got it wrong, the way industrial strikes and so on lead to revolution. So cultural Marxism is much, much more sophisticated. But I think here's the point. There's a huge amount of guilt in America because of race, in Europe because of colonialism, things like that. And so someone said they're rather like an unexploded minefield. And the citizens can wander on it, set off a bomb. But more importantly, a foreign agent can come and set it off deliberately. And so, the civil rights movement did in tremendous amount, particularly legally, in putting right the Jim Crow era. But there's no question that America still, or parts of America, feels guilty about racism and slavery. And that's what the cultural Marxism, you have a race Marxism, and then you have a sex Marxism, and they know how to go for the jugular.
Right. Well, Os, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. Always a joy to speak with you.
Oh, my privilege. Thanks for having me.
My guest, Os Guinness, author and social critic. We've been talking about the Magna Carta of humanity and how we, especially here in the United States, have to reclaim an objective definition of what it means to be free and virtuous. Thank you for joining us on Ave Maria in the afternoon. Until next time, I'm Marcus Peter.